International Women's Day is a very important day. It happens every year on the 8th of March. People all over the world celebrate it. It's a day to think about women and their rights. It's a day to remember how far women have come and how much work is still needed. This day is not just about celebrating, it is about action. Imagine a world where everyone is treated the same, no matter if they are a boy or a girl, a man or a woman. That's the main idea behind International Women's Day. It's about gender equality. This means that women and men should have the same chances in life. They should have the same rights. They should be able to do the same jobs and get paid the same money. But for a long time, this wasn't true. In many countries, women couldn't vote. They couldn't own property. They often couldn't get the same education as men. They were often told that their place was only in the home. International Women's Day started because women wanted to change this. They wanted to be treated fairly. This book is about the story of International Women's Day. It's a story that goes back more than 100 years. It's a story about brave women who stood up for what they believed in. It's a story about big changes, and also about the problems that still exist today. Today, International Women's Day is about many things. At its heart are the big ideas of gender equality and women's rights. Gender equality means that women and men should have the same opportunities and rights in all areas of life. Women's rights are about making sure that women are treated fairly and with respect. In the chapters that follow, we will explore the story of International Women's Day in more detail. We will look at how it began, how it grew around the world, and how people celebrate it today. We will discover the key moments and important people who have shaped this day. From its early beginnings to its global recognition, the story of International Women's Day is a story of hope, action, and the ongoing fight for a better future for women everywhere. 2. The beginning. The story of International Women's Day starts in the early 1900s. At that time, many women around the world wanted more rights. They wanted to vote, have better jobs, and be treated equally to men. In different countries, women started to organize and speak up. One of the first events was in the United States. On the 28th of February, 1909, the Socialist Party of America organized a Women's Day in New York City. A woman named Teresa Malkiel, who was an activist, had the idea for this day. People have said that this day was to remember a protest by women workers in 1857. However, historians say this is not true. But the 1909 Women's Day was still a very important start. The idea of a special day for women then traveled to Europe. In August 1910, there was a big meeting in Copenhagen, Denmark. This was the International Socialist Women's Conference. Women from 17 different countries came to this conference. Important women like Clara Zetkin, Kata Dunker, and Paula Thiede from Germany were there. They were inspired by the American Women's Day. These German women suggested that there should be a special Women's Day every year. They did not decide on a specific date yet. The 100 women at the conference agreed that this day was a good idea. They thought it would help to get equal rights for women, including the right to vote. The next year, in 1911, the first International Women's Day was celebrated. It was on the 19th of March. More than 1 million people joined in Austria-Hungary, Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. In Austria-Hungary, there were 300 protests. Women marched in the streets of Vienna. They carried flags to honor women who had fought for rights in the past. Across Europe, women made important demands. They wanted to vote in elections. They wanted to be able to work in government jobs. They also protested against unfair treatment at work, where women were paid less than men for the same job. These first International Women's Day events were about asking for basic rights and fair treatment for all women. In the beginning, there was no fixed day for International Women's Day. People celebrated it at different times, usually in late February or early March. In America, they continued to celebrate Women's Day on the last Sunday in February. In Russia, they celebrated International Women's Day for the first time in 1913. It was on the last Saturday in February, according to their calendar at the time, which was the 8th of March in the calendar used in other countries today. In 1914, International Women's Day was held on the 8th of March in Germany for the first time. Maybe they chose this date because it was a Sunday that year. Like in other places, the focus in Germany was on women getting the right to vote. German women did not get this right until 1918. At the same time, in London, there was a march to support women's right to vote. A famous activist, Sylvia Pankhurst, was arrested during this march. She was on her way to speak to people about women's rights. These early celebrations of International Women's Day were important first steps. They brought women together across countries to ask for change. They showed that many people believed in equality for women and were ready to fight for it. 3. War and Revolution. The early years of International Women's Day were a time of big changes in the world. One of the biggest events was World War I, which started in 1914. This war had a strong effect on the lives of women and on International Women's Day. During the war, many women started working in factories and other jobs that were usually done by men. This was because many men were away fighting in the war. Women showed they could do these jobs just as well as men. At the same time, women in many countries continued to ask for more rights, like the right to vote. International Women's Day became a day to protest against the war and to ask for peace. Women believed that peace was important for everyone, and they wanted to have a voice in making the world better. One of the most important connections for International Women's Day is with the Russian Revolution. In 1917, Russia was in a difficult situation because of World War I. There was not enough food, and people were unhappy. In the Russian capital city, Petrograd, women workers decided to take action. On the 8th of March, 1917, which was the 23rd of February in the old Russian calendar, women who worked in textile factories started a demonstration. They went into the streets and asked for bread and peace. They wanted to end the war, stop the food shortages, and get rid of the Tsar, who was the Russian emperor. This day, International Women's Day, was not planned to be the start of a revolution. Leon Trotsky, who was a leader in the Russian Revolution, wrote about this. He said that on that day, the 8th of March, people knew it was International Women's Day, and there might be meetings and protests, but nobody thought that this Women's Day would actually begin a revolution. However, that morning, women workers in different factories decided to stop working. They asked other workers to join them. More and more people joined the strike, and soon, many people were in the streets. This demonstration by women on International Women's Day grew bigger and bigger. It became a mass strike and the start of big changes. These events are now known as the February Revolution in Russia. Just a few days later, the Tsar Nicholas II had to step down from power. After this revolution, a new government was formed, called the Provisional Government. One of the first things this new government did was to give women the right to vote. This was a huge victory for women in Russia and for the women's rights movement around the world. Because International Women's Day in 1917 was the start of such important changes in Russia, it became very significant for socialist and communist groups. After the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks, who were the Communist Party in Russia, started to celebrate International Women's Day on the 8th of March. They saw it as the day that marked the beginning of the revolution and the progress for women's rights in Russia. Over time, especially after the Bolsheviks took full control in the October Revolution, International Women's Day on the 8th of March became a key holiday in communist countries and for communist movements around the world. It was a day to remember the women workers of Petrograd and their role in the Russian Revolution. It also became a day to celebrate women's rights and to continue the fight for equality and peace, ideas that were central to the communist ideology. So, the period of war and revolution was a turning point for International Women's Day. It moved from being a day connected to socialist women's movements to becoming strongly linked with the Russian Revolution and communist ideals. The events of the 8th of March, 1917 in Petrograd showed the power of women to bring about big social and political changes, and solidified the 8th of March as the date for International Women's Day, especially within communist and socialist circles. 4. Growing through the world. After the Russian Revolution, International Women's Day started to spread to more countries. It became very important in countries with communist or socialist governments. In these places, IWD was a day to celebrate women and their role in society. In the Soviet Union, the 8th of March became the official date for International Women's Day. It was a way to remember the women who started the revolution in 1917. In 1965, it even became a public holiday in the Soviet Union. This meant people did not have to work on this day, and it was a time to celebrate women's achievements. Big celebrations, like parades, were common in countries like Czechoslovakia. China also began to celebrate International Women's Day. In 1922, Chinese communists started to observe the day. By 1949, when the People's Republic of China was created, the 8th of March became an official holiday for women. Women in China were given half a day off work to mark the occasion. In 1927, there was a big march in Guangzhou, with 25,000 women and men showing their support for women's rights. Even in countries that were not communist, International Women's Day began to be noticed. In Australia, the first celebrations happened in 1928. A group called the Militant Women's Group organized a rally in Sydney. These women were asking for things like equal pay for equal work and paid holidays. Later, in 1931, there were marches in Sydney and Melbourne. More women joined these marches each year. In 1938, a big meeting in Perth brought together women from many different groups, all supporting International Women's Day. In Spain, during a difficult time before the Spanish Civil War, a communist leader named Dolores Ibarruri led a women's march in Madrid in 1936. This showed that even during political problems, women still wanted to fight for their rights. From the 1920s to the 1960s, International Women's Day continued to spread slowly around the world. In the United States, a group called the Congress of American Women was formed on International Women's Day in 1946. This group was connected to a larger international organization called the Women's International Democratic Federation. The Women's International Democratic Federation was created in 1945 in Paris. The Congress of American Women supported equal rights for women in their homes and at work. They also supported workers' rights and equal rights for everyone, regardless of their background. Although it was seen by some as linked to communist ideas, many different types of women joined, including those who were not communists. The Women's International Democratic Federation became an important group for women's rights around the world. It helped to connect women from different countries and share ideas about how to improve women's lives. It showed that International Women's Day was not just a day for one country, but a day for women everywhere to come together and work towards a better future. In Singapore, in 1956, women in the People's Action Party created a women's league. They organized rallies on International Women's Day, showing that the day was becoming important in Asia too. By 1958, International Women's Day was also being celebrated in places like Trinidad and Tobago, and in 1965, it was marked for the first time in Afghanistan. These examples show that from 1920 to 1960, International Women's Day started to take root in many different parts of the world. even beyond the socialist and communist countries where it began. It was slowly growing into a global day for women. 5. A day of action. In the late 1960s, something changed for International Women's Day. For many years, it was mainly celebrated in communist countries. But now, a new group of women started to see its importance again. These women were part of what is called the second wave feminist movement. They wanted big changes for women in society. For these feminists, International Women's Day was not just a holiday. It became a day for action. In Europe, some people even called it Women's International Day of Struggle. It was a time to fight for important things that would make women's lives better and more equal. In the 1970s and 1980s, many groups joined the feminists to celebrate International Women's Day. These groups included people from the left wing of politics and workers' groups. They all marched together and spoke out about what they wanted to change. What were these important things? One big issue was equal pay. Women often did the same work as men, but they did not get paid the same amount of money. People on International Women's Day said this was not fair and demanded equal pay for equal work. Another important issue was reproductive rights. This is about women having control over their own bodies and decisions about having children. Women wanted the right to choose if and when to have children, and access to safe health care. Ending violence against women was also a very important goal. Women faced violence in their homes, in the streets, and at work. People used International Women's Day to speak out against all forms of violence against women and to ask for protection and justice.